was thrilled to speak with Susanna Barkataki. We discussed what it means to make space to grieve, and Susanna also offers a lens to process grief through based on yoga philosophy. We also talked about what it means to turn towards one's grief. Susanna Barkataki is a yoga culture advocate, trainer, writer, and teacher. She is the Director of Education for Ignite Institute for Social Change in Yogic Studies. She is the creator of the Honor Don't Appropriate Yoga Summit and Framework, and creator of HonorYogaCourse.com, dedicated to bringing yoga and equity tools where they are needed most. She's the author of the book Honor Yoga's Roots, Courageous Ways to Deepen Your Yoga Practice. She has an honors degree from UC Berkeley, a master's in education from the Institute of Humane Education, and is an ERYT 500-hour teacher, yoga therapist, and Ayurvedic practitioner. She's honored to teach in the Sri Adi Shankaracharya lineage in the Hatha Yoga tradition and is ordained into the mindfulness tradition of Thich Nhat Hanh. Susanna supports clients in expanding their leadership, integrating authentic yoga through training, speaking, online courses, consultations for studios, companies, and nonprofits. I hope you enjoy the interview with Susanna.
Hi, Susanna.
Hi, Michelle. It's really good to be here.
It's good to see you. Thank you for saying yes to this conversation.
Absolutely.
So I would love it if you would begin with a centering, inviting myself and the people listening and watching to center.
Absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. So I have a meditation bell. It was a gift to me from my cousins and comes all the way from Nepal. And I use it as a bell of mindfulness, just to remind me to come back to my breath and come back to my center and find my true home within myself. So I'll invite the bell 3 times and then guide us together. So if you'd like, you can let your eyes gently close or gaze at a spot in front of you. Let your shoulders roll back and down. Close any other distracting things that may be there. If you're multitasking, let stuff go just for a few moments. And let's listen to the sound of the bell together. Listen, listen. This beautiful sound calls me back to my true home. As you breathe in, simply be aware that you are breathing in. And as you breathe out, become aware that you are breathing out. In, out. And perhaps today you need to take a deep breath in and a sigh out to signal to your mind and your body and your soul that you are present and releasing anything that you need to release in this moment. And we'll take one more breath like that, audibly. And now allow your awareness to rest in your body, noticing anywhere where there may be tension, and let a little bit of ease ride on your awareness. So for me, that's my shoulders, my jaw, chest and belly, And as I bring my awareness there, I see if I can release just a little bit more in those places. And then knowing that showing up for these conversations and this work is no small thing. And we'll take a moment to thank ourselves and all of the beings that have supported us in getting to this point in our lives, in this point in our practice, this point in this moment. So just taking a few breaths and letting your awareness go to mentors, teachers, friends, travelers with you along this path, students. They don't have to be related to you, could be blood family, spiritual family, other beings. And as you call all of this team, this squad into awareness, feeling the nourishment of knowing that we are never alone. Even in the hardest moments, there are those who are out there cheering us on. And send them thanks and gratitude. And then bring your awareness back to yourself, your body, this moment. And thank yourself for being here. And if you would like, you can slowly start to roll the shoulders back and around. Perhaps lifting the shoulders on an inhale and dropping them on an exhale, or going the other way, whatever feels good to you. And then if you'd like, you can drop your ear to one side and then the other, getting a little stretch in the neck, or even rolling the neck around, opening up the throat, the sides of the neck. And then if you are rolling in circles, letting your head roll the other way. And then we'll take just a few more rotations to let the head come to stillness. And as you're ready, I'll invite the bell and we'll open our eyes if they're closed. And take a moment to look around your space, noticing 5 things around you. Whatever they are, you can say their names in your mind. And then connect your heart or your center, and we'll come back into the space together. Thank you for going on that journey with me. It really helps me to both receive and to guide centering meditations like that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for centering us and leading the meditation and being here. I would love for you to share some about the work you do in the world.
Yeah, I kind of see myself as like an instigator and like a graceful door kicker downer, and an educator. So I do a lot of thinking about how we can use wellness and activism together. And I do that in different ways. So whether it's through writing or through organizing or through teaching classes online or in person, really my goal is like systemic change through the avenue of poetry and literature and, body embodiment and movement and community building. So it's not like a label, but if I had to give myself a label, I guess it would be like yoga unity activist.
I like that. I know it can be hard when you're doing, I mean, many different things to have like one label in what you're doing. That resonates. So I hear you.
Yeah.
Understand that. And I would love to hear some about, you know, why you said yes to this conversation about collective grief and liberation, and even the connection between the two from your perspective.
You know, really, like, I'm just going to be very real. I always try to be. I am someone who, even though I do work on spiritual bypassing and I talk about it, I recently realized about myself that I have a spiritually bypassing personality. Like, my nature is to jump to, you know, it'll be okay, or what's the bright side of this? And I think that is a superpower of mine. I'm very grateful for having that positivity and optimism. And it means that sometimes I am not comfortable with my own grief, and sometimes I probably make other people not comfortable with their own grief and or their own anger. And so part of why I said yes is because it's an area of growth for me, and I've seen you, you know, work very skillfully with guiding people with all the same kinds of things that we do, like grace equity work. And I really value your leadership in holding this work as grief work as well. And so I wanted to challenge myself, and then also kind of share what, like, the process internally with folks, because just because we're in some sort of status of like expert doesn't mean the work is ever done in here. So I'm doing the work.
Yeah, thank you for doing the work. It's not easy. Or in my experience, it hasn't been easy for people to talk about grief, and myself to talk about grief or to work with it. It took time to learn how to be with loss, because it's what we're experiencing as we're experiencing joy or other things, right? And receiving loss is happening because we're alive in bodies moving on the planet at this time. So thank you for challenging yourself. And can you share some about how you see the connection between grief and liberation? And this can be personally or systemically or culturally, however you want to answer it.
Yeah. So, you know, my teachers talk a lot about, like, my main meditation teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, always says, I've heard him say this in so many talks, you know, if I had children, I wouldn't want them to be in a heaven where there was no suffering, because without suffering, we can't fully know joy. And so he's really helped me. And I think people who read Thich Nhat Hanh's work think he's like this sweet, cuddly, like, let's all, you know, like breathe in the flowers and breathe out love. And he is, but he's also very adept at showing the interconnectedness of liberation and suffering, and the inherent nature that's in Buddhist thought, right, which is connected to yogic thought, of suffering is part of life, you know, impermanence and change is part of what we are all here and all dealing with. And so on that sort of conceptual level, I feel like I deepen in my understanding of that. And then the personal things that have happened for me, when I first was thinking about our conversation, I actually was going to share my most recent experience with grief was actually like huge. Well, no, there's been more recent ones, but a big one was when I had my child 7 years ago. I had a really wonderful pregnancy. I worked hard, you know, and exercised and just felt really good in my body, and also really intended to have a particular kind of birth. Like, I intended to have a home birth, very natural, and it's birth, right? It's like death. It's not something we can control, no matter how much we do hypnobirthing. But I didn't really realize that. I don't think, I don't know. And there's a big kind of story in the wellness industry about the dangers of the medicalization of birth, which I'm sure many are true. But in my experience, it went totally differently than I had envisioned. And I had a really hard labor. And luckily, my son was fine, and I was fine. I was kind of fine, but I was like emotionally and physically really exhausted because I was in labor for over 3 days. And I really was grieving after I gave birth to him. I was grieving, I think that loss of like trust and faith in the alternative kind of community, loss of faith in myself. I think I thought I could control that outcome, you know, and if I did everything right and like exercise and did, you know, all that stuff. And then I also was grieving, and people don't talk about this as much, but like all of a sudden I could not walk out of the house, just, you know, like walk out and get some milk or get, you know, whatever I needed or take a walk around the neighborhood. I had this living, breathing, like amazing and terrifying thing, that baby that I was responsible to, and more than responsible, like tethered to. And so I was really grieving who I was before I had a baby. And all of that, you know, and I think was heading into postpartum depression and just was in a very hard place for myself. And what happened from it, even though when I was in it, you know, now looking back, I'm like, I'm just glad he was fine and alive and I made it through, right? It's not that big of a deal looking back that the birth didn't go the way I intended, like, duh, right, it's birth, it's intense. But what happened is my heart opened, and I was able to actually sit with the grief and the sadness of other people, not necessarily around birth, but just anything that they were having trouble dealing with or grappling with in a way that I hadn't been able to before I had that experience. And so to me, because connection is a part of freedom and liberation, I really feel like my personal experience of grief in that way led me to more liberation, more ability to feel and to connect and to relate.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing what you did, what you just shared. And one thing I really appreciate about what you shared is I don't feel like in this culture and dominant culture, we're talking about what it means to birth a child. I don't have children, but I've been a therapist and worked with many women or people who had postpartum depression. And it's just like, there's so much silence around it, and so much silence around your identity is not the same as it was before you birthed a being into the world. And so I just appreciate you highlighting that or elevating that from your own experience, because I think there's so much silence. Again, it's not my lived experience. I just remember sitting with people and being like, why aren't there gazillions why isn't it just normal to say, I'm not actually happy I have a baby right now, or it's changed everything. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it was like the double arrow. This again, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about, it's like the grief, and then the arrow of like, I have a baby, I'm supposed to be so joyful, and I feel terrible, and I feel incompetent, and I feel like I don't have anyone to talk to about this. And, you know, it just was there were so many layers. I actually was lucky because I had someone who volunteered they were doing their doula training, and they did postpartum doula support with me. And as part of their training. And I just having someone to talk to who could normalize that grief and that loss and that whole process was really huge. So friends were helpful, but a lot of my friends didn't know, and I'm sure therapy would have been helpful, but I didn't quite get there quick enough, you know, and the doula was there. I think I got there a few months later to therapy. Mm-hmm. That really helped too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Are there lessons that you've learned from grief? I mean, you just shared an experience of grief, and I know there are others. So are there lessons you would like to share from your experience of grief and loss?
You know, I think that the lessons are so personal, right? In the sense that one of the things I'm aware of because I want to share some, but that if anyone's listening and may have experienced the same trauma or other trauma, but doesn't experience the lesson that I'm going to share. And so I just want to kind of normalize that like my lessons aren't necessarily the right lessons or the only lessons from different experiences of grief that we might have. So I realized just this week, actually, that my whole life has been a process of grieving and mending and holding like generational grief, because I was born to parents both their parents didn't want me or my brother to be born. And so the whole world, you know, they couldn't find anyone to marry them. my mom is white, my dad is Indian. And so just coming into a world that doesn't want you alive is such a shock to the nervous system, and like a continued shock, right? And there's so many layers of that trauma that just show up in different places and all through like moments that I remember. And so I think for a long time, I felt very not at home, and which is part of why I led the guided meditation that I did. Is I felt so not at home, like not at home in England because I was Indian, not at home in the United States where I moved because I was an immigrant and I wasn't, I didn't fit in as a brown skinned person in a very white world where, even though not everyone around me was white, it was like white normativity. And by the time I actually went to India, I had the inner realization that actually home wasn't about how other people saw me or whether I felt welcomed or not by them. Home was something I could define for myself. And so that process of reclaiming, like finding a sense of home, has really been a lesson that came from that grief of like, I don't really belong anywhere. And there's people who completely reject me or call me ugly or say that, I don't belong. And within my family, in my community. And for a long time, there was a lot of anger, a lot of sadness, but I found, and some people might relate to this, but that my anger really went in. So I had a lot of self-hate through my young adulthood and through my early, my teens and into my 20s. And around mid 20s, when I started to do meditation and yoga more completely, like more deep practice, was when I had the aha, like it's actually not about any of them or the place I'm in. And so that lesson of like profound self-love and like profound self-acceptance, and then I am at home here and anywhere. It's almost hard to communicate it in words, but it's like it was like a whole different perspective on life. And so slowly, and this happened through that time, I became someone who I think I set people at ease because I'm at home with myself. And so I see people with the same eyes, like where I'm not judging, I'm just like welcoming whoever they are and being in relationship in that way of inviting them more into their own home and their home in their own skin and their own experience. And so those have been some pretty incredible gifts, both for me and I feel like just around me, in the communities. And so since then, what's interesting too is I've had a lot of great, I'm working on this in Orlando, Florida, but I've had a lot of, everywhere I've lived, since that change, I've been blessed with like really like tight community and people who I've been able to support through the hardest and most impactful things. Like, in fact, that's another huge gift, is because we were so struggling in LA with a number of folks. At the time, we called ourselves Tribes of the Diasporas or Tribe of the Diasporas. I don't think we'd use that same word now because not all of us were indigenous to the United States. Some people were, but we formed a community that, like, when Patrisse Cullors' brother, Monty, who she writes about, and When They Call You a Terrorist, which is a book I think everyone should read. When her brother was going into prison, we would set up, community funds. When another friend's brother was being locked up for whatever reason, we would organize for the legal fees. When another friend was having a mental health break, we would be there all night, all day, take her to the hospital ultimately. It's like that support that we showed up like hard because there was so much suffering. And I don't think we would even know what's possible if we hadn't suffered.
Yeah, it sounds like you wouldn't know what was possible or what was needed, right? Unless you could turn towards the suffering and actually name it as that. And then, several people in this that I've interviewed for this summit have talked about, it's called healing in community, right? And so a lot of people have talked about that being the way. Of course, it's not the only way we heal, right, or respond to grief, but it's been highlighted enough that it's made me really curious about what if we had more space to heal in community and show up in the way that you just named, and to see each other and see the suffering, not that it's the same or to sort of neutralize everyone's experience, but just to be able to be with it more, because the culture really distracts us from it.
It really does.
Yeah. And it doesn't actually provide good models for how to show up. I mean, we may have that in our family or in our friend group or connected to ethnicity, but dominant culture doesn't, in my experience, hasn't shown me how to show up for people. I had to learn that.
Right. And I was reading actually like Martin Luther King's speech in Cobo Hall last night, and he was talking about being so happy to see the militancy of the Black community, like this new, and he was calling it a newfound militancy. And of course, also saying like, let's remain nonviolent. But he was really naming that as people had been gathering in churches and in, you know, civil rights community meetings, there was a grieving, but also a power that came from those meetings. And so I don't actually think it's accidental that we don't meet in these places to grieve, because, and I think of South Africa, right? And the film Amandla, if folks haven't seen it, is another amazing resource. But there had to be this continued grief, but the grief like fueled because so many activists were dying, anti-apartheid activists were dying, but the grief came to song, and then the song came to resolve, and then there was the next protest and the next protest, and it just is such a, to me, it's so heart-opening and inspiring to see what's possible. And that for us, you know, in the community in LA, it was really about showing up and support. But we honestly did a lot of art. One of the first events I remember doing was a Juneteenth event. And for that event, like folks like me and the other non-Black folks were in the back supporting, right, the performance art and the work of the Black leaders in our community. And then we did something called Earth Path of the Deities, where we brought out like a fashion show, and we read, you know, we did spoken word. So there was so much life that came from the art that was born from our hopes and our struggles and our grief.
That's beautiful. I love that.
Yeah.
And it's connected to the next question, which is about ritual. So, and practice, I think it's connected to that, right? That you engage if you're moving through a process of loss and grief, or making space to grieve. What are some rituals that you call in or that you practice?
So I studied Ayurvedic, you know, science, and so often when I'm trying to move through something in my life, I look at it from the lens of Ayurveda, which is the sister science to yoga, and really is like Indian indigenous mental, physical, spiritual health, for folks who might not know that. And there's this idea that there's the three elements, or three kind of qualities of life: sattva, rajas, and tamas. And sattva is like purity and kind of truth, and rajas is energy and movement, and then tamas is like solidity, but also can be stagnation. And so for me, grief often lives kind of in tamas, grief in my heart and soul and being. And so I try to call in things that cultivate the other two, right? Rajas and sattva. And so I'll practice more of, I mean, the truth is when I'm really in my grief, the real truth is I'll allow myself to be in the tamas. I'll let myself be in the sadness and be in the suffering, journal about it, cry, you know, not do anything for a day. So I just want to also say, I'm not saying we have to move too quickly out of it. So I guess that's a ritual too, just like acknowledging it and being with it, welcoming it, kind of like a friend, or like I learned to do with my baby, you know, like hold the baby, like when the baby's crying, you hold the baby, but what they don't tell you, and that I discovered, is that, and I don't think it's just me, maybe, but when the baby's crying, sometimes the caregiver or the parents, right, or the baby, can be anything, could be ourselves. My first impulse is anger, or is run away, or is shut that down. And because that's my first impulse, it actually has to be like a care for myself and then a care for the crying baby, whether it's a baby outside or the baby inside me. So it's like a moment of like, oh, I am really angry, or I am really sad. and what do I need? And so that's that tamas part, just acknowledging. And then more movement. I really like to do like rituals of movement outside. So hiking, for me, nature feels like church. Anywhere I can go now, it's like forests and swamps. And then also for Sapa, it's practice. When I'm ready, reading spiritual texts or reading the words of teachers, you know, Pema Chodron, who has written books that I turn to again and again when I have been grieving, like things fall apart, or the places that scare you, because I feel like I need that wise counsel, to kind of, the wise counsel that doesn't push away the truth of this, like the absolute horror or impossibility of what I'm facing, but then also gives me some way of managing it or working with it. And then meditation and yoga practice.
Thank you for sharing your rituals and also sharing about them, and the framing you offered around how grief might be held, and then the energy that's brought in, and then when you turn to study, which of course is more than framing for you, right? It's connected to who you are. I just use that word because for me, it's not, you know, I had to learn that, right? It was not something that was in my blood or that ancestors passed down to me with that language. So that's why I use that word to describe it.
Yeah. And then the other thing I will share, because the thing that my ancestors, my aunt and aunts and uncles in particular have modeled for me is like having a puja, having an altar, and going to that altar and doing the practice. And so, and I think, you know, what their altars look like and what my altar looks like may be different from what someone else's altar looks like. Sometimes my altar is, you know, a stand of trees. Sometimes my altar is my yoga mat and my journal. Sometimes it is a formal altar with a water bowl and deities and, you know, flowers. And, but going to that place of connecting to ancestral wisdom and just opening up to it, allowing space and time for it to come to us. That is another ritual that I take really seriously, especially when the grief is connected to the loss of a loved one. It's like spending time trying to connect with their energy and their knowledge and the wisdom of what they've gifted to my life when I'm ready to do that part.
Yeah, that reminds me, I interviewed someone, their name is Claudel Glasgow, and their interview aired last week. And they talked about ancestors and like having a picture of their ancestor at the table, like engaging with ancestors that have transitioned because there's still a relationship. And what you just said made me think about that. Like, what is it like to put a picture of my grandmother on the kitchen table if I want her to be part of dinner, right? Like, what does that actually look like? Or I mean, she is on my altar, right? And what does it look like to talk to her and engage her energy? So,
yeah, it's so true. A number of my teachers say, like, you can look in the palm of your hand and see that ancestor, right? Whether they're blood or land ancestors or spiritual ancestors or any ancestor. And so there's this beautiful practice that comes from Manzanita Village from Catriona Reed, who's a trans Buddhist yoga teacher, and Michelle Benjamin Mickey. And they share this practice of walking meditation where you take a step and then you repeat a phrase. And I love it so much. I practice this a lot, which is, I walk with my ancestors. My ancestors walk with me. I breathe with my ancestors. My ancestors breathe with me. I am my ancestors. My ancestors are me. Yeah, that one is pretty powerful.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, talk about coming home to yourself. That's what it seems like, that practice would bring you right back home to who you are. So what do you feel like it might look like? Because we've been talking about practices that you engage and rituals. What might it look like for us culturally to prioritize space to grieve, this conversation about grief, in order to find some freedom or liberation? What ideas do you have about that, just from your perspective? What might it look like?
I mean, I would love if, because I was thinking about like systemic and structural change, but there's all these big companies now are doing wellness initiatives, you know, like Bank of America, all these massive companies. But what if part of what they did was just hold space for, you know, in healthcare, companies funded us to, and like grassroots activists and organizations to just hold community healing and grieving spaces. Um, I think sometimes it's helpful when ideas go mainstream like that. And so that's like the vision of what I see, where it's like, oh, here's our support plan for our employees, and you get 12, you know, community circles a month. Part of why I see that is because that's what organizations like Dignity and Power Now that work to end sheriff and police violence in Los Angeles are doing, is offering like acupuncture, healing circles, counsel circles for those affected by the criminal justice system and their families, right? So it's like a lot of times the grassroots community activists and healers and, you know, are leading the way and are leading the path. Like the answers are with us and they're already here. But we just might have to look to alternative models and that are happening creatively and outside of a big system to see what can be brought into that big system, and not in a way that's like performative where they're just doing it to look good, but really inviting in folks who could lead those in the way that they're needed. Because what I found to be the best kind of format for holding a circle is really council space, which I learned first from Thich Nhat Hanh, but also I believe he learned from, you know, indigenous communities in the United States, and has like, so it's a practice that's been happening on this land where I sit, you know, Seminole land, and probably all over the US and many other places, of non-hierarchical sharing. So there's not like a teacher at the front of the room who's saying, you know, this is how we handle grief. Because I think there are a lot of spaces, you know, like that, like in the system. I mean, just to be really honest, like when my partner was dealing with the loss of his dad, or we have folks in our family who have Alzheimer's and dementia, and people talk all the time about like, find a circle, do this, but it's not easily accessible. And then when we are able to find it, it's very kind of top-down oriented. So like, we're going to go and we're going to learn some things, but that's actually not what's, I don't feel has been really needed for myself or for him. It's more space to just share and to hear other people's experiences and hold each other.
Yeah, I love the idea about wellness companies including this as part of just the services that are offered to their employees, right? And or opening up their spaces for that, for community, and inviting that in. And it sounds like there are some models of that happening that people could look to.
And I'm really curious actually for you to answer that question, because I love and so appreciate that you've been doing this work for so long. And as an organizer, as a therapist, like you bring all these different perspectives. Where do you think, like, what's your vision of what this work might look like?
You know, thank you for asking me. I think it's part of the reason I actually, this idea to create the summit came to me is because I feel like people are grieving in silence and are grieving in response to both their individual losses and what's happening all around us. I think the losses are potentially visible in a way that they haven't been before because of social media. Of course, many of us have been feeling what's been going on for a long time, and we have ancestral trauma, right, held in our bodies. And there's a heightened, it seems like there's a heightened awareness of how traumatic the culture is, dominant culture is, and how it's harming us. And so I feel like, you know, it would look like us making space to, in the way that you named, right, and circles, healing circles, spaces to come to actually process how we are responding to what's happening around us. And my idea is that if we actually do that collective, like as a group, we can shift some of the way we are. Like we can, it's sort of a different form of resistance, like a different, I mean, resistance in the sense of like resisting dominant culture and creating new ways of being. It feels like that, but there's a compassion to it and a tenderness that feels connected to it through allowing people to grieve because in so many spaces I facilitate, I think that's what I'm offering. And it's a shift for people because I'm not invited to grieve in most spaces I interact with, right? Or, you know, with people I encounter. And so, I think my vision is us having space to actually name what we know, what's going on for us, but to do that and be witnessed in it in order to find ways to move through, to find some of that liberation and freedom. They feel so connected to me. I don't think we can heal unless we actually talk about the things we've been talking about. I don't, as a collective, individually, I may be able to heal, but I'm connected to the collective. So I'm not actually sure I can heal unless we're doing that together. That's a little bit about what it could look like. And ritual and ceremony connected to that as well. And people bringing that from their lineages, right? So that there's a sort of co-creation of that in spaces.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah. I'm here for it. Yeah.
Good. Sign up. Let's do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It needs to happen. We need to do something different. Yeah, for sure. So what does collective liberation mean to you? Like, what would that look like? That feels really connected to the question you just asked.
You know, I've had this image in my head a lot recently of these caves in the south of India, Ellora. Often people say Ajanta and Ellora. And Ellora are caves, like huge stone caves that are carved intricately with the heads of deities, or tell stories about our healing and our liberation. And what's incredible about them is that on the far left, there's a Jain cave, one of the kind of other religions in India that's very much into nonviolence and non-harm. There's Buddhist caves, there's Hindu caves, and they've lived and coexisted. I mean, to make these caves, they're so enormous that they must have been carved over hundreds of years, right? So, but there's no evidence, and they're thousands of years old. They date back, you know, to before Christ. And so there's no evidence of war or violence, but just of perhaps they were competing for who would have like the best cave, right? Or the best carving. But they were coexisting with going deep into their own practice, and obviously had influence. There are signs that they were right next door, so they influenced one another. And so I think it's that, you know, that image of like, we can each go in deep into our own practice and our own artistry and our own way of praying and our own way of being with what is true for us. And we can coexist and do it alongside other people that don't do it the same exact way, but celebrate the way that they're doing it. And so that image, like, what does that look like? Because right now we're so far from that. We're so far from that. And this is like our ancestors, right? Thousands of years ago, they were able to pull that off for many, many years.
I mean, that's certainly something to aspire to, right? That it's happened, it's possible. We just have to remember.
Yeah.
And dominant culture works hard to make us forget and be disconnected from even the awareness of what you named, right? And the artifacts or gifts that our ancestors left us as like a map to kind of figure out how we create something different other than what's going on, you know, right now. Yeah. So I'm wondering if there's anything you want to share. I know you have a lot coming up. And so is there anything you want to share about what's coming up in 2020, what you're excited about, anything you want folks to know, and know that they'll have your website and information to connect with you, that they'll have that, and it's at the end of the interview, and they'll also have it on the website for this summit.
So great. Yeah, I am excited because I have a book coming out, and I am really, really thrilled about taking all the work that I do with honoring yoga's roots and also with social justice, and kind of looking at, well, where in the tradition have been the stories and the guideposts all along of how we can do the work of building together as a community within yoga practice. So I'm just really excited about that. And then I have a real passion for taking little things that come up in our practice, like the fact that people say namaste at the end of class, and they don't say that, they say namaste at the end of class. And then asking questions for, well, is that actually appropriate for a way to end class, or could there be other ways to end, or why are we doing that? And so I have a training called Namaste Masterclass that is just ask some questions to kind of give some information and some research on how we might end our yoga classes appropriately, or yoga practice, or kind of inquire into that ritual and devotion in a more thoughtful way. So those are the two main things. And then we are co-leading a retreat in Asheville in September, is it?
Yes, I know. It feels like, what? It's happening. It's the end of the second week of September. Yeah.
That's really about a lot of this too, like grief and healing and ritual and connecting back to ourselves and to the world. So I'm excited for that.
I'm excited for that too. The opportunity to work together in that way.
Yeah.
And I'm so excited about your book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you for creating the offering for us to learn from, and offering the wisdom.
It's a journey, right? It's been such a journey. And now it's just letting go. I have to let go.
Yes.
Get it out there. All the little details. But I think it's going to be a really interesting resource, just like Skill in Action has been, for people to go deeper and ask questions about where their practice can take them, and what it can look like, and what are some, other opportunities for insight that they may not have had. So I'm very excited about a lot of our colleagues who are writing books, and for your next book, and for this one. Just, I feel like we're getting to kind of shape and reshape the landscape of what it is to practice in this time, and into the future, to practice any kind of healing modality. And that's a really powerful thing to be a part of. And for folks who are watching and listening, like, you're a part of it too, right? Like all of us are creating this shift in culture together. We're creating a new paradigm, which is very exciting to me.
It is exciting. Yeah, it's exciting to be part of, and be connected with people who are saying we need to do something different than what we've been doing, which is so much of what I'm seeing now, which is different than when I was certified to teach yoga, which was in 2009. I know people were talking about this. I hear about it a lot more now than I did then. And it makes me, it's time. It's like about time. And it makes me happy that folks are elevating this conversation and shifting culture. So yeah, and you're a big part of that. So
yes,
thank you.
Be here with you.
Well, thank you for saying yes, and for sharing all that you did through this interview. And I'm really appreciative of who you are, and all of the work you do. And one of my healers, when I was about to put out Skill in Action, release it, she said, just let it go and let it do what it's going to do. And so I know your book is going to do, like, there's a lot that's happening, right? And I think back to that sometimes, because it really, like, released, and then it did what it's, it's like, it's doing what it's doing. And it was just helpful for me to hear her say that. So I don't, you can, if that resonates, you can allow it to, and if it doesn't, then you can let it go. It was just nice to let go and be like, oh, it's out in the world doing its thing.
Yeah.
As an extension of who you are.
It's like a baby, right? It is a baby in a way. It's a creative baby. And we do that. Parenting really is a process of greater and greater letting go. And as is creating any of this, coming back to, there's a kind of grieving and joy in all of that.
Yeah, for sure. Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for your time today.
Yes.
I really appreciate you.
Appreciate you too. Thank you.
Thank you.